If you're a Philadelphia Eagles fan, this is one of those stories that seems simple at first glance, but the more you think about it, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because this isn't just about a player being released, it's about a rare, heavy, and extremely symbolic move made by a direct rival right before the playoffs, involving a high-level defender with a proven history of real impact in the league. And when something like this happens inside the NFC East, nothing is accidental. The Dallas Cowboys made a decision that draws attention not only because of what it is, but because of when it happened. A move that raises questions, creates internal noise, and exposes something the team may not have wanted to admit right now. It's not common to see a direct rival let go of an experienced player right before the postseason. That doesn't feel like careful planning, it feels like a fracture. And when there's a fracture in a roster on the doorstep of the playoffs, the problem is usually deeper than it looks. The NFC East has always been driven by rivalry, resentment, and decisions made at the edge of emotion. Eagles and Cowboys don't operate by thinking only about football. There's pride involved, there's narrative, there's fear of strengthening the enemy. And that's exactly why this decision feels so strange. Because this isn't just any player. This is a name that once symbolized Dallas's defense, someone who was treated as untouchable, someone who changed games with the ball in his hand. The player released was former All-Pro cornerback Trevon Diggs. Yes, that Trevon Diggs, a cornerback who once led the NFL in interception, the face of the Cowboys' secondary for years, and a constant presence in big games. Now suddenly, he's gone. And that alone should set off alarms across the division. But what really stands out isn't just the fact that Diggs was released. It's the context, it's the timing, and most of all, it's who's watching all of this unfold with calm, composure, and a silence that usually says a lot. Howie Roseman. And when it comes to Howie Roseman, silence never means inactivity. Quite the opposite. It's usually the clearest sign that something is being evaluated with extreme care. Howie doesn't react on impulse. He lets the market cool. He allows other teams to expose themselves, make mistakes, create internal noise. Only then does he decide whether it's worth stepping in. And almost every time he does, it's because he saw something others didn't. That kind of maneuvering is even more dangerous at this point in the season because most franchises are focused only on their own rosters. Very few teams take the time to closely examine what their rivals are letting slip away. And that's exactly where opportunities appear. Opportunities that don't show up in stat sheets, medical reports, or press conferences. Quiet opportunities, but potentially decisive ones. The relationship between Diggs and the Cowboys had been deteriorating for quite some time. There were conflicts with the front office, internal decisions that frustrated the player. There was the issue of a $500,000 salary de-escalator after Diggs chose to rehab away from team facilities during the offseason. All of that created a steadily worsening environment. But even so, cutting a name of that magnitude at this point on the calendar is an extreme decision. And when a rival makes an extreme decision, the question isn't whether Howie Roseman will respond. The question is how, and how far he's willing to go. From the Eagles' perspective, the picture is clear. The defense is strong, well-built, aggressive, and deep at several positions. But the cornerback group, when you look beyond Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, has shown vulnerabilities at times this season. Adoree Jackson has been inconsistent. There have been games where the secondary struggled more than it should have. And in the playoffs, those kinds of flaws are simply unforgivable. That's where Trevon Diggs starts to emerge as an intriguing possibility. Not as a savior, not as a featured star, but as depth, as a calculated gamble, as a quiet addition who doesn't need to carry the defense, but could be extremely useful in specific situations, especially when Plan A breaks down, and most importantly, at the right price. According to market expectation, any team claiming Diggs off waivers would be responsible for a guaranteed $472,000 game check. That almost guarantees he'll clear waivers and become a free agent. In other words, the real cost for an interested team could be minimal, a cheap contract, a controlled risk, exactly the type of move Howie Roseman has historically loved to make. There's also a psychological factor in this kind of signing that often goes unnoticed. When an experienced player joins an already strong roster without the pressure of being the solution, the impact can be different. He plays looser, he takes more chances, And in some cases, he ends up delivering more than expected, especially when that player feels he still has something to prove. In Trevon Diggs' case, that motivation is obvious. Being released by a direct rival after years of being treated as a core piece leaves scarred, and players in that situation often step onto the field with a different sense of urgency. It doesn't always work, but when it does, the effect can be immediate. Over the years, the Eagles have specialized in this kind of bet. Veteran players with a cold market, coming from complicated situations, but who can still contribute in a more stable and competitive environment. It's nothing new. We've seen it in past seasons. Some bets worked, others didn't, but the logic was always the same. Low cost, high potential payoff. There's another important factor here. Trevon Diggs isn't going to sign just anywhere. He was just released by a direct rival. He's coming off a frustrating, injury-limited season. He knows time is passing. At this stage of his career, everything points to one priority above all else: competing for a Super Bowl. That automatically narrows the list of possible destinations. Non-playoff teams don't make sense. Rebuilding projects don't appeal. He'll look for a competitive defense, a scheme that suits him, and an environment where he can contribute without being the center of attention. And when you look at the Eagles' defense, that fit starts to look increasingly realistic. Of course, there are risks. They can't be ignored. Diggs has dealt with multiple knee injuries. He struggled to adapt to the zone-heavy scheme used in Dallas. He even admitted difficulties with cover 2 read. Communication issues surfaced throughout the year. All of that works against him. Still, in the playoffs, the idea of perfection simply doesn't exist. No roster enters January flawless. No team arrives fully healthy and without weaknesses. What separates those who advance from those who fall is the ability to minimize damage and respond quickly when things go off script. And that's exactly where defensive depth becomes so valuable. A veteran cornerback doesn't need to play 100% of the snaps to make a difference. Sometimes he enters in a specific package. Sometimes he covers a receiver in a critical situation. Sometimes he simply allows another player to rest for a few snaps. In the playoffs, those details stack up, and before you realize it, they decide game. And this is where things become most uncomfortable for the Cowboys. If Diggs ends up in Philadelphia, even as a rotational piece, the psychological impact would be massive, not just because of the player himself, but because of what it represents. A former All-Pro Cowboy reinforcing the Eagles' defense in the playoffs is exactly the kind of storyline no one in Dallas wants to see become reality. It fuels the rivalry, it creates headline, it generates tension, and above all, it reinforces the idea that the Cowboys lost control of the situation, that a poorly managed internal decision opened a dangerous door for their biggest rival. From the Eagles' point of view, there's no obligation to make this move. The defense is already strong. The roster is already competitive, but that's never been how Howie Roseman thinks. He thinks in margin, in contingencies, in extreme scenarios, in games that completely break from the script. In the playoffs, injuries happen. Unexpected adjustments arise. Quarterbacks exploit mismatches without mercy. Having one more experienced option in the secondary can be the difference between surviving and being eliminated early. The real question isn't whether Trevon Diggs is still the player he once was. He isn't. The question is whether he can still help in specific moments. And the honest answer is maybe. And maybe, at this point in the season, is enough to justify the gamble. There's also a broader reading of this situation across the NFC. Other teams are watching. Other front offices are paying attention. Because when a rival like Dallas makes a move like this, it raises doubts about stability, direction, and internal confidence. And in January, any sign of weakness is exploited without mercy. The Eagles know this. They've been on the other side of this story before. They've made costly mistakes in the past. They've learned, sometimes the hard way, that there is no safety margin in the playoffs. That's why every detail matters. Every available name matters. Every decision made, or not made, carries real weight. Now, all that's left is to wait. See if Diggs clears waivers. See how the market reacts. See whether Howie Roseman decides to act or simply observe from a distance. But one thing is certain. When a direct rival makes a major decision right before the playoff, ignoring it is rarely a safe option. Because in the NFL, especially in January, it isn't always the big moves that decide seasons. Sometimes it's the quiet gambles. And no one understands that better than the Eagle.